Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The manila folder on my desk shouldn't exist. That's what I keep telling myself as I stare at it. Thick, weathered edges curling up like dying leaves. The label reads, Friday Visits, Unborn Cases. My supervisor, Janet, dropped it off this morning with that same tight smile she always wears, the one that never quite reaches her eyes. "Sarah," she said, placing her hand on my shoulder, "you've been with Child Protective Services for what, 3 years now?" 3.5, I corrected, already sensing where this was heading. "Good, then you're ready for the Friday rounds. Before you think I'm crazy, before you close this video and move on to something else, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you is real, every word. And if you're listening to this late at night, maybe with your headphones on, trying to fall asleep, well, you might want to turn on a light. Because once you know about the Friday visits, you can't unknow them. And now, the story begins. The thing about working for CPS in Portland, Maine, is that you think you've seen everything. Neglected kids living in houses with no heat during February blizzards. Parents too strung out to remember they have children. The worst of humanity laid bare in case files and court documents. But the Friday visits, nobody talks about those. I found out why when I opened that folder. The first page looked normal enough. Standard intake form. Address, 11247 Brackett Street, Apartment 3B. But where the child's name should be, there was just a series of numbers. 2019, 10, 15, NB. Never born. October 15th, 2019. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped to the case notes. The handwriting changed every few entries. Different social workers over the years, but the reports were always the same. Child appears healthy. No signs of distress. Environment suitable. Toys remain in same position as last visit. Child does not interact. Mother continues to maintain nursery. Recommend continued monitoring. I looked up at Janet, who was still standing in my doorway. I don't understand. These are cases for children who were never born? She nodded slowly. Stillbirths. Miscarriages, the ones that almost made it. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. The ones that still need checking on. That doesn't make any sense, Sarah. Her tone sharpened. Every social worker in this office has done the Friday rounds. It's part of the job, non-negotiable. You visit the addresses, you fill out the forms, you don't ask questions. She paused at the door. And Sarah, you never, ever touch anything in those rooms. The rest of that Thursday crawled by. I couldn't focus on my regular cases, kept flipping through that folder. 15 addresses, 15 children who were never born. Each file contained photos of empty nurseries, cribs with untouched sheets, toys arranged just so. But in every photo, something felt wrong. Like looking at a room through frosted glass. Everything slightly out of focus except for the shadows. In each photo, no matter the angle or lighting, there were small shadows. Child-sized shadows. Standing by the cribs. Sitting on the floor with the toys. Shadows with no source. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty rooms. Heard something that sounded like crying, but not quite. More like an echo of crying, the memory of sound. Friday morning came too soon. I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic outside the first address, 1247 Brackett Street, for 20 minutes before working up the courage to go inside. The building was one of those converted Victorian houses you see all over Portland's West End. Beautiful from the outside, probably worth a fortune. But something about it felt cold, even with the September sun beating down. The hallway to apartment 3B smelled like vanilla candles and old carpet. Normal. Completely normal. I knocked 3 times. "Come in," a voice called. "It's unlocked." The woman who answered looked exactly like her file photo. Rebecca Morrison, 34 years old. Lost her baby at 8 months. That was 4 years ago. "You must be the new Friday worker," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Sarah, right?" I nodded, throat suddenly dry. "Tommy's room is down the hall. Second door on the left." She turned back to the kitchen. "I'll make tea." Tommy. She'd named him Tommy. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should. My footsteps echoed wrong, like there were 2 sets of feet walking. The door to Tommy's room was painted bright blue, with wooden letters spelling out his name. Tommy. The M's were slightly crooked. I pushed open the door and froze. The nursery was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Crib with rocket ship sheets, mobile spinning slowly despite no breeze. Toys scattered on a playmat like a child had just been playing. But the room was cold, so cold I could see my breath. And in the corner, by the window, a shadow, small, child-shaped, watching me. I blinked and it was gone. Just trick of the light. Had to be. I pulled out my forms, hand shaking as I wrote, "Environment suitable, no signs of distress." But as I turned to leave, I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible. Giggling. By the 5th house, I'd noticed the pattern. Every mother, and they were always mothers, never fathers, had the same hollow look in their eyes, like they were seeing something I couldn't, or maybe wouldn't. They all made tea. They all directed me to the rooms without following. And they all said the exact same thing when I left. "See you next month." Not goodbye, not thank you for coming, always "see you next month." The 6th address broke me. It was in Scarborough, just outside Portland proper. A small ranch house with an American flag out front and one of those wooden signs that said "The Johnsons" in cursive letters. Normal, so painfully normal, but the woman who answered the door, she was young, maybe 22. Her file said the baby, a girl named Emma, was never born 3 months ago. Fresh case. But this woman looked like she'd aged 20 years in those 3 months. Hair gone gray at the temples, hands that shook constantly, and her eyes kept darting to something behind me, following something I couldn't see. "Emma's room," she whispered, pointing down the hall. "Please, please don't wake her." The room was pink, soft, baby pink with white trim, a crib in the corner with a mobile of butterflies. And on the changing table, the baby monitor was on. The screen showed the crib, the empty crib, but the sound, breathing, soft, rhythmic baby breathing coming through the speaker. I grabbed the monitor, hands trembling, and looked closer at the screen. The crib was empty, completely empty. But the mattress had an indent. A small, baby-sized indent, like something invisible was lying there. Something touched my shoulder. I spun around, nothing. The room was empty, but now I could smell it. Baby powder, fresh, like someone had just changed a diaper. I ran, dropped my clipboard, left my pen, and ran. The mother didn't try to stop me, just stood in the doorway, that hollow look in her eyes, and said, "See you next month." I made it to my car and called Janet immediately. "I can't do this," I gasped into the phone. "Something's wrong with these houses. These mothers. They're seeing things that aren't there." "Are they?" Janet's voice was calm. Too calm. "Or are you just not seeing what is there?" "Janet, please. Finish the rounds, Sarah. All 15 houses. It's important." "Why? Why is it important to check on children who were never born?" The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, very softly, "Because they're still waiting, Sarah. They're still waiting to be born. And someone needs to make sure they stay that way." She hung up. I sat in my car for an hour, watching the house, trying to make sense of what she'd said. And then I saw it, in the window of Emma's room. A shadow, small, moving, playing with something I couldn't see. And behind it, another shadow, adult-sized, sitting in what must be a rocking chair. Rocking back and forth, back and forth. The mother, sitting in an empty room, rocking an invisible baby. Or maybe not so invisible. House number 10 changed everything. It was in Cape Elizabeth, right on the coast. One of those massive colonials with ocean views that tech money had bought up. The kind of place where everything should be perfect. But perfection, I was learning, was where these things like to hide. The woman who answered was different. Professional blazer. Hair pulled back in a tight bun. Eyes clear and focused. Her name was Dr. Patricia Chen, and according to the file, she'd lost twins 7 years ago. "You're early," she said, checking her watch. "The others usually don't come until after 3. "The others?" She studied me for a moment. "You're new to Fridays." It wasn't a question. "First day," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "Come in. But not to their room, not yet. We need to talk first." She led me to a home office lined with medical journals, psychiatry, neurology, and others with titles I didn't recognize. Journals of liminal studies, consciousness and quantum reality, the kind of academic writing that made my head spin. "Tea?" she offered. "Everyone offers tea." "It helps," she said simply, pouring 2 cups, "with the seeing." I don't understand any of this. Dr. Chen sat across from me, hands wrapped around her mug. "What do you know about quantum consciousness?" "Nothing." In simple terms, consciousness, the observer, collapses possibility into reality. We see a thing, and it becomes real. But what happens to the consciousness that never fully forms? The ones that almost were? I stared at her. "My twins," she continued, "were alive for 6 minutes. 6 minutes in this world before their lungs failed. But for those 6 minutes, they existed. They had consciousness, awareness, and when they died..." She paused. "Where did that consciousness go?" "I don't..." "It stayed, Sarah. It stayed because I couldn't let go. None of us could. We kept their rooms, kept their clothes, kept believing, hoping, observing. And our observation, our refusal to accept the empty rooms, it kept them here, trapped between being and not being." My teacup rattled against the saucer as my hands shook. "That's not possible, isn't it?" She stood, walking to the window. "Every Friday, a social worker comes, files a report saying the children are fine. The state's official documentation that these children exist. Legal papers, government recognition, and that recognition, that observation by the system itself, it makes them more real. Why are you telling me this?" She turned back, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. "Because it's getting stronger. They're getting stronger. At first, it was just the shadows, then the sounds. Now..." She pulled up her sleeve. Small bruises covered her arm. Tiny handprints. "They want to be born, Sarah. Fully born. And they're getting angry that we can't give them what they want." A crash came from upstairs. Then another. The sound of toys being thrown against walls. "I should go check on them," Dr. Chen said calmly, like this was normal. "You can see yourself out, and Sarah, whatever you do, finish the rounds. All 15 houses. If you don't..." "What happens if I don't?" "They follow you home." She disappeared upstairs, and I heard her voice, soft and soothing. "Mommy's here. It's okay. Mommy's here." I left, but as I reached my car, I looked back at the house. In the upstairs window, 3 shadows. 2 small, 1 adult. But Dr. Chen lived alone. The twins had no father listed in the file. The twins had never been born. But there they were, playing, as real as shadows could be. I should have stopped, should have driven home, quit my job, moved to another state. But Dr. Chen's words echoed. They follow you home. So I kept going. Houses 11 through 14 blurred together, each one colder than the last, each shadow more defined. By house 14, I could make out features. The curve of a cheek, the reach of small arms, the turn of a head following my movements. They were becoming real, and I was helping it happen. The 15th house wasn't on any map. The GPS kept recalculating, leading me down roads I'd never seen despite living in Portland my whole life. Roads that shouldn't exist. Until finally, I found it. A small cottage at the end of a dirt path, surrounded by trees so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. No name on the file, just an address and a date, 19/7/08/15 NB, 37 years ago. The door was already open. Inside, the cottage was frozen in time. 80s furniture, wood paneling, a kitchen with avocado green appliances, and dust. Layers and layers of dust on everything. Everything except the nursery. The nursery was spotless, pristine, like someone had just cleaned it moments ago. But it wasn't just one crib. The room was filled with them, dozens of cribs, each with a mobile spinning, each with an indent in the mattress. And in the center of the room, an old woman in a rocking chair. She looked up as I entered, and I recognized her immediately. Janet, but older. Much older. Like she'd aged 50 years overnight. "You came," she said, voice barely a whisper. "Good, they've been waiting." "Janet, what is this place?" "The first house," she replied, still rocking. "Where it all started. My daughter. She was never born. August 15th, 1987. But I couldn't let go. Couldn't accept the empty room. So I kept visiting, kept checking. And then I found other mothers who couldn't let go. I created the Friday rounds. The temperature dropped so fast I could see ice forming on the windows. "I thought I was helping," Janet continued, "giving them recognition, existence. But I didn't understand. They don't just want to exist in the shadows. They want to be born, truly born, and they need someone living, to trade places." The shadows began to move. All of them. Dozens of child-shaped shadows crawling out of the cribs, moving toward me. "That's why we need the new social workers," Janet said, standing up. But as she stood, she flickered, like a bad TV signal. "Fresh observers, strong life force, someone who hasn't been worn down by years of visits." "You're not real," I gasped, backing toward the door. "You're one of them." She smiled, that same tight smile from yesterday. "I haven't been real for 3 years, Sarah. None of us have. The supervisors, the senior staff. We're all Friday cases now, checking on ourselves, maintaining the system." The shadows were closer now. I could hear them. Not crying. Laughing. The sound of children playing. Children who wanted to play forever. "But you can stop it," Janet said, her form flickering more rapidly. "Break the pattern. Don't file the reports. Don't complete the rounds. Let us go." "But you said they'd follow me home." "They will. But only if you run. Stay. Face them. Tell them the truth." "What truth?" "That they were loved, that they were wanted, but that they were never meant to be." The shadows stopped. Waiting. Watching. I thought about all those mothers, the hollow eyes, the shaking hands, the desperate need to believe their children existed. And I thought about these shadows, these almost children, trapped between existence and void. "You were loved," I said to the room, my voice shaking. "All of you. Your mothers loved you so much they couldn't let go. But love, real love, sometimes means saying goodbye." The spinning mobiles slowed. The shadows wavered. "You were never born," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "But you were real. For moments, for heartbeats. You existed in hope and dreams and possibility. That's enough. That has to be enough." One by one, the shadows began to fade. Not disappearing, just softening, becoming lighter. And as they faded, I heard them, not crying, not laughing, sighing. The sound of finally being able to rest. Janet was the last to go. As she faded, she looked younger, like the woman who'd hired me 3 years ago, like the mother she'd been before grief froze her in time. "Thank you," she whispered. And then I was alone, in an empty cottage, surrounded by dust and silence. I drove back to the office in a daze. The building was different, smaller. A note on the door said CPS had moved to a new location in 2021. 3 years ago. I called the number. A woman answered, a real woman with a tired voice and the sound of phones ringing in the background. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said. "I worked for CPS." "Sarah Mitchell." She sounded confused. "We have a Sarah Mitchell in our records, but she died 3 years ago. Car accident, the same day she was supposed to start." I hung up, but I didn't go home. Not yet. Something nagged at me. The first house I'd visited. Rebecca Morrison and Tommy. I needed to see if she was real. 2147. Brackett Street looked different in the late afternoon light. Warmer somehow. More alive. I knocked on apartment 3B. Rebecca answered, but she looked different. Healthier. The hollow look was gone from her eyes. Behind her, I could hear the sound of children playing. Real children, living children. "Sarah?" She seemed surprised to see me. "I didn't expect—" "Wait, how do you know my name?" I was here this morning, for Tommy's room." Her expression changed. Confusion mixed with something that might have been relief. "Tommy's room?" She turned toward the hallway, then back to me. "There hasn't been a Tommy's room for months. I converted it. Finally, it's my home office now." She invited me in, and I could see it was true. The nursery was gone. In its place, a bright office with a computer and filing cabinets. Photos on the wall showed Rebecca with a man I hadn't seen before. Wedding photos, vacation pictures, life moving forward. I thought I had, she struggled with the words. After I lost the baby, I kept his room exactly as it was, for 4 years. But then one day, I woke up and realized he was gone. Really gone, and I was still here, still living. I needed to live. What changed your mind? The strangest thing. I had this dream. This woman. She looked like you, actually. Told me it was okay to let go. That love doesn't mean holding on forever. It means accepting what is and what isn't. I left Rebecca's apartment with my head spinning. If she was real now, if Tommy's room was gone, then what had I experienced that morning? What had any of us experienced? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check the others. I spent the next week visiting every address from the folder. What I found challenged everything I thought I understood about what had happened. Emma's mother in Scarborough was gardening in her front yard. She looked healthy, vibrant. When I asked about Emma, she smiled sadly but peacefully. "I planted a garden for her," she said. gesturing to a small memorial plot with a headstone no bigger than a book. It helps, having somewhere real to visit, instead of pretending she's still. Dr. Chen's house was bustling with activity. A children's birthday party in the backyard. I watched from my car as she laughed with what appeared to be her very much alive twins. When she saw me, she waved me over. "Sarah, right? From the grief counseling group?" She looked confused. "I don't remember giving you my address." "You're twins," I gestured toward the children. "Adopted," she said, beaming. "After I lost my first pregnancy, my husband and I went through years of fertility treatments. Nothing worked. But then we realized there are so many children who need homes. We adopted Marcus and Lucy 3 years ago. Best decision we ever made." Every house told the same story. The mothers were real. Their lost children were really gone. But they had moved on, healed, found ways to honor their loss without being trapped by it. So, what had I seen in those Friday rounds? What had we all seen? The answer came from an unexpected source. A letter in my mailbox, written in my own handwriting. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then you figured out the first part. The Friday rounds weren't about checking on dead children. They were about checking on the living, on us. The CPS office closed 3 years ago when the Friday program was exposed. Turns out, it wasn't sanctioned by the state. It wasn't official at all. It was a support network created by a grief counselor named Janet Morrison, who lost her own daughter. She recruited social workers who had their own losses, who understood the pain. But something went wrong with the program. Instead of helping people heal, it became a way to avoid healing, to stay trapped in grief. The Friday rounds were supposed to help mothers process their loss gradually. Instead, they became a way to never process it at all. When the program was shut down, some of us couldn't let go. We kept coming back, kept performing the rituals. But the mothers had moved on. They'd healed. The only ones trapped in that cycle were us. You died in a car accident on your way to your first day at CPS. But some part of you, the part that wanted to help, that couldn't bear the thought of abandoned children, that part couldn't rest. So you joined the Friday program. Not as an employee, but as a client. Every Friday, you checked on the version of reality where those children needed checking on, where their mothers couldn't heal, where your job still mattered. Because the alternative, the truth that you never got to help anyone, that you died before you could make a difference, was too painful to accept. The other social workers in the program were the same. All of us lost something. All of us died, in one way or another, before we could finish what we started. So we created a reality where our work was still needed. But tonight, when you told those shadows they were loved but needed to rest, you weren't just talking to them. You were talking to all of us, to yourself. It's time to let go, Sarah. The mothers are fine. They've healed. Their children are at peace. And now, so can you. With love and understanding, Sarah. P.S. The manila folder was always empty. You filled it with your own need to be needed. But that need, it's not who you are. Who you are is someone who loved so deeply that not even death could stop you from trying to help. That's beautiful. That's enough. I put the letter down with shaking hands. Around me, my apartment began to change. The furniture I'd never remembered buying faded. The life I'd built for 3 years as a ghost dissolved like morning mist. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time in 3 years, or maybe for the first time ever, I felt complete. Through my window, I could see them. Other Friday workers. Other helpers who couldn't let go. They stood on street corners in empty buildings, performing their routines. But one by one, they were beginning to look up. Beginning to see. Janet appeared beside me, but not the flickering version from the cottage. The real Janet. Young again, peaceful. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded. "What about the others, the ones still trapped?" Every story like yours helps free them. Every person who reads about the Friday rounds and understands the real message. It weakens the cycle. Some of them are already waking up. The rest will, in time. And the mothers? The real ones. They're living their lives. They've taken the love they had for their lost children and found ways to share it with the world. Some volunteer at children's hospitals. Others adopt. Some become teachers or counselors. Love doesn't disappear when there's no one left to receive it. It finds new homes. I thought about Rebecca with her office full of life, Dr. Chen with her adopted twins, all the real mothers who had found ways to transform their grief into something that helped others heal. That's what we were supposed to do too, wasn't it? I asked. Transform our own losses into help for others. Yes. But we got lost in the wanting to help. We forgot that sometimes the greatest help we can give is knowing when to step back, when to trust that people can heal on their own. The apartment continued to fade around us, but instead of emptiness, I felt fullness, completion, the satisfaction of a job finally finished. Will anyone remember us? I asked. Janet smiled. The best helpers are the ones nobody remembers needing. Their success is measured not in gratitude, but in independence. In the people who get to move on because someone cared enough to show up, do the work, and then let go. As the world dissolved completely, I heard something I hadn't heard in 3 years. Silence. Real silence. Not the desperate quiet of held breath, but the peaceful silence of rest. Epilogue. The real Friday rounds. If you've made it this far, you might be wondering if any of this was real, if the Friday rounds actually exist, if there are social workers checking on children who were never born. The truth is more complicated than that. There are support networks for bereaved parents. There are grief counselors who specialize in pregnancy loss. There are organizations that help families process the loss of children who died before birth or shortly after. These are real, necessary healing services staffed by living people who do incredible work. But sometimes, in the spaces between official programs, other networks form. Groups of people so committed to helping, so unable to accept that their help has limits, that they create their own reality where their services are always needed. They're not malicious. They're not evil. They're helpers who can't stop helping. Fixers who can't accept that some things can't be fixed. Lovers who can't accept that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. If you work in helping professions, if you're a social worker, therapist, nurse, teacher, counselor, pay attention to your own need to be needed. Notice when your desire to help becomes more about you than about the people you're trying to serve. Learn the difference between supporting someone's healing journey and preventing them from taking that journey at all. And if you're someone who has lost a child, born or unborn, know that your grief is valid. Your love is real. Your loss matters. But also know that healing is possible, that moving forward isn't betrayal, that you can honor what was lost without sacrificing what remains. There are no Friday rounds checking on children who were never born. But there are Thursday morning support groups for parents learning to live with loss. There are Tuesday evening therapy sessions for people processing complicated grief. There are Wednesday afternoon volunteer opportunities for those ready to transform their pain into purpose. The real help happens in real time, with real people, in the messy, complicated, beautiful process of healing. It doesn't require supernatural intervention. It just requires showing up, doing the work, and trusting the process. And sometimes, it requires knowing when to step back, when to trust that love, once given, continues to exist even when its original recipient is gone. That the capacity to love and be loved doesn't disappear with loss. It transforms. It finds new homes. It helps others heal. That's the real Friday rounds. Not checking on what's gone, but nurturing what remains. Sweet dreams. See you next month. Actually, no. See you when you're ready. When you've done your own work. When you've healed enough to help others heal without getting lost in the helping. See you when it's time. And that time is up to you. Author's note. This story was inspired by the real experiences of bereaved parents and the dedicated professionals who support them. While the supernatural elements are fictional, the grief, love, and ultimate resilience of people who have lost children is profoundly real. If you or someone you know is struggling with pregnancy loss or infant loss, please reach out to organizations like SHARE, First Candle, or your local hospital's bereavement services. Help is available. Hope is possible. Healing, while never simple, is always within reach. Story number 2. My grandfather's CB radio still sits on my dashboard. Dead silent for 3 years now. Until tonight. The static broke at exactly 2:47 a.m. with 4 words that made my blood freeze. "Don't stop there, kid." The voice was his. I know that's impossible. Grandpa Joe died hauling steel through these mountains in 2021. But I'd recognize that gravel-rough Tennessee drawl anywhere. And he only ever warned me about one place. Before you think I'm crazy, let me ask you something. Have you ever driven Interstate 77 through southern West Virginia at night? That stretch between Beckley and Princeton where the mountains press so close you can't see the stars? Where your radio cuts to static and your phone shows no service for 40 miles straight? If you have, then you've passed it. Mile marker 23. The last Appalachian rest stop. And if you're smart, you kept driving. The story begins now. I never meant to stop there. Nobody ever does. My name's Marcus Webb, and I've been driving trucks for 7 years now. Started when I was 21, right after Grandpa Joe's funeral. He left me his old Peterbilt and a notebook full of routes, delivery contacts, and warnings. Page after page of which truck stops had the best coffee, which way stations to avoid on Fridays, and circled 3 times in red ink. Mile 23, never stop. Never. For 3 years, I listened, filled up in Beckley or pushed through to Princeton, planned my routes so I'd never need to stop in that 40-mile dead zone. Other truckers do the same, though nobody talks about why. It's like an unspoken rule. You just don't stop at mile 23. But I should have paid more attention to Grandpa Joe's other warnings, the ones scattered throughout that notebook like breadcrumbs. Things I dismissed as an old man's superstitions, like the page about the collection routes, certain highways where drivers just vanished. Not crashes, not breakdowns, just gone. Their trucks found idling on the shoulder, doors open, keys still in the ignition. Or the list of names. 43 drivers over 30 years, all last seen on Interstate 77, all between mile markers 20 and 25. When I first read it, I figured it was just Grandpa Joe being morbid, keeping track of friends who'd died in accidents. But now I wonder, were they really accidents? There was a photo tucked in the back of the notebook, too, black and white, probably from the 70s. Showed that familiar brown brick building I'd drive past every month, the last Appalachian rest stop. But in the photo, it looked different. Wrong somehow. The angles didn't match what I remembered. The building seemed bigger, more windows than it should have. And standing in front of it, a group of people, drivers probably. They all had the same expression, the same blank stare, the same hand position. Tonight, everything went wrong. Started with the storm. October rain in Appalachia isn't like rain anywhere else. It comes sideways, thick as curtains, turns the asphalt into black glass. My wipers couldn't keep up. The defroster fogged my windows from the inside, and I was hauling a full load of furniture to Charlotte. Deadline tomorrow morning. No time for delays. Should have stopped in Beckley, I know that now. but the truck stop there was packed. 20-minute wait for diesel. I figured I could make Princeton easy. My gauge showed a quarter tank, more than enough. Then the engine started coughing, just a little hiccup at first, the kind you ignore. Hope it goes away. But 5 miles out of Beckley, it got worse. The temperature gauge crept toward red. Something was wrong with the cooling system, maybe a leak, maybe worse. But thinking back now, I wonder if the engine trouble was real, or if something was calling me to that place, making sure I'd have no choice but to stop. Because the closer I got to mile marker 23, the worse it got, like the truck itself knew what was waiting. Mile marker 18 passed in the rain. Then 19, 20. The engine knocked, sputtered. The temperature gauge hit red. Mile marker 21. That's when I noticed the silence on the CB. All night there'd been chatter. The usual late-night conversation between drivers trying to stay awake. Complaints about weather, jokes, warnings about speed traps. But as I passed mile marker 21, it all stopped. Not gradual, just silence. Like every trucker on the eastern seaboard had suddenly gone mute. Steam started seeping from under the hood. White wisps in my headlights. Mile marker 22. And then I saw it. That faded blue sign barely visible through the rain. Rest area, 1 mile. My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. But what choice did I have? Blow my engine in the middle of nowhere. Or pull off for 10 minutes, let it cool down, add some water, and get out fast? The exit ramp appeared like a mouth in the darkness. I took it. The moment my tires left the interstate, the rain stopped. Not slowly, not naturally, just stopped, like driving through a curtain into another room. The silence hit harder than the storm had. No rain on the roof, no wind, no static from the CB, just my engine ticking as it cooled and my own breathing. Too loud in the sudden quiet. But there was something else. A sound I couldn't quite identify at first. Low. Rhythmic. Like breathing, but too big to be human. Too slow. Like the mountains themselves were drawing breath. The rest stop sat in a bowl between mountains, lit by those old sodium lights that turn everything orange and sick-looking. One long building, brown brick from the 70s, with men's and women's restrooms on either end and vending machines in the middle. A dozen parking spots for cars, 4 for trucks, all empty except for one. A Freightliner, navy blue, parked at the far end. But now that I was here, I could see details that hadn't been visible from the interstate. The building was wrong. The proportions didn't match my memory. It stretched too far back into the darkness, like it kept going beyond what should have been possible. The brick looked newer in some places, older in others, like it had been built and rebuilt dozens of times, each addition slightly off from the last. The vending machines hummed, but their lights were out. Through the glass, I could see the usual selection of sodas and snacks, but everything looked faded, like the colors had been drained away. I pulled in 3 spaces away. Habit from years of giving other drivers their space killed the engine. The ticking got louder, like finger bones cracking. Steam still rose from my hood, but less now. I'd need to wait at least 20 minutes before adding coolant. 20 minutes at mile marker 23. I grabbed my flashlight, the heavy mag light that doubles as a weapon if needed, and climbed down from the cab. The ground felt wrong under my boots, too soft, like stepping on carpet instead of asphalt. The air tasted stale, recycled, like breathing inside a sealed room, and cold. Much colder than it should have been. My breath misted in the air, but the temperature had been in the 60s when I left Beckley. Now, it felt like winter. The other truck's engine was off, but the running lights glowed. Someone was in there. Maybe sleeping, maybe watching. The windows were too dark to see through. I popped my hood. The radiator hissed like something angry. Definitely a leak. Probably a cracked hose. I had spare coolant, but it would only be a temporary fix. Enough to reach Princeton, though. Enough to get away from here. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the restroom building. A man emerged from the shadows between the vending machines. Tall, maybe 6'4", wearing a flannel shirt that might have been red once but looked brown in the sodium light. Jeans, work boots, the uniform of 1,000 truckers. But his face... Have you ever seen a photograph that's been copied too many times? Where the features blur, become suggestions rather than details. That was his face. I could see he had eyes, a nose, a mouth, but if you asked me to describe them, I couldn't. They kept sliding away from focus. Engine trouble? His voice was normal, too normal, like someone doing an impression of how they think people should sound. Just overheating. I kept my voice steady. Be out of here in a few minutes. He took a step closer. His boots made no sound on the asphalt. That's a nice truck. Peterbilt, 94? 95. Had one just like it once. Good trucks, reliable. He tilted his head, studying my rig. You know, there's a better place to park, around back, more room, better light to work on that radiator. Every instinct screamed no. I'm good here, thanks. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Couldn't, because I still couldn't quite see his eyes. Suit yourself, but you might want to move that truck. This spot, it's got problems, drainage issues. Your friend found that out. My friend? He gestured to the Freightliner. Been here, 3 hours now, maybe 4. Kept saying he'd leave soon. Just needed to rest his eyes a minute. You know how it is. 3 hours. At a rest stop. No trucker stays at a rest stop for 3 hours unless something's wrong. He okay? The man's smile widened, too wide. Why don't you ask him yourself? I looked at the Freightliner. Still no movement. The running lights flickered. Just once. Like a blink. When I turned back, the man was gone. Not walking away. Not behind the building. Gone. Like he'd never been there at all. But I could still smell him. Diesel fuel and something else. Something sweet and cloying. Like flowers left too long in a closed room. I should have left right then. Overheating engine or not, I should have driven until the motor seized. Would have been better than what happened next. But I needed to check on that other driver. Trucker code. You look out for each other. Even in a place like this. Especially in a place like this. I walked to the Freightliner. Flashlight in one hand. Phone in the other. Still no signal. The screen showed the time. 3:23 a.m. Somehow, an hour had passed since I'd pulled off the interstate. That wasn't possible. I'd only been here 10 minutes, 15 at most. The truck's door was unlocked. It opened with a soft click. The smell hit first. Not death. Not exactly. More like absence. Like the air inside had been scrubbed of everything that made it air. Sterile. Empty. The driver sat behind the wheel, a heavy-set man in a cowboy's cap and denim jacket. His hands rested on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead through the windshield. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed from outside. His logbook was open on the passenger seat. I could see the entries. Same route over and over. Interstate 77, Beckley to Princeton. Same load, same delivery time. The dates went back months. The handwriting got shakier as the pages went on, like he was fighting to write each entry. The last entry was from tonight, but it was wrong. It showed him arriving at mile marker 23 at 11:47 p.m. That was impossible. It was only 3:23 a.m. now. That would mean he'd been here over 4 hours, not 3 like the tall man had said, unless time worked differently here. Hey, buddy. I kept my voice calm. "You all right?" He didn't move, didn't blink. I reached out, touched his shoulder. He was cold. Not dead cold, but like he'd been sitting in a freezer. His skin felt waxy, artificial, like a mannequin. He turned his head toward me, slow, mechanical, like a doll on a swivel. I'm just resting my eyes. His lips moved, but the voice came from somewhere else. Behind me, above me, everywhere but his mouth. "Just need a minute. Long drive ahead." "How long you been here?" "Just a minute. Just resting my eyes. Long drive ahead." The same words, the exact same tone. I backed away from the door. His head swiveled back to face forward, hands at 10 and 2. That's when I saw the others. In the car parking area. A Honda Civic with Pennsylvania plates. A woman behind the wheel. Hands at 10 and 2. A Chevy Tahoe from Ohio. Family of 4 inside. All facing forward. All with their hands positioned exactly the same. But there were more vehicles than I'd first noticed. An old Ford pickup from the 80s. A minivan with Florida plates. A motorcycle with the rider still straddling it, hands on the grips in the same position. How had I missed them before? And they were all covered in that same thin layer of dust. Not road dust, something finer, like ash. All with their eyes open. My phone buzzed. The screen flickered. For just a second, I had a signal, 1 bar. A text message tried to load from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words appeared before the signal died. "Don't look up." Of course, I looked up. The restroom building's roof was covered in birds, hundreds of them. Crows, maybe, or ravens, too big to be anything else. They sat in perfect rows, silent, all facing the same direction, all watching me. But as I stared, I realized they weren't just birds. Some were too big. Some had the wrong shape. Some had too many eyes. They were perched on power lines that hadn't been there when I'd arrived. The lines stretched away into the darkness, connecting to poles that seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the mountains. One cawed, then another, then all of them at once, a sound like tearing metal. They didn't fly away. They fell, straight down, like someone had turned off whatever held them in the air. They hit the ground around me. Soft thuds on that too soft asphalt, and immediately stood up, walked toward me, not hopping like birds do, walking, on their legs, upright. Some still looked like birds. Others had changed, grown, stretched. Their beaks had become too long, too sharp. Their wings dragged behind them like broken umbrellas. I ran, back to my truck, slammed the door, turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. The birds surrounded my truck, standing there, watching with eyes that reflected the sodium lights like coins. But now I could see that some of those eyes were human. Blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, all staring with the same blank expression as the drivers in their vehicles. The CB radio crackled to life. "You should have listened, kid." Grandpa Joe's voice, clear as day. "I'm trying to leave. The engine won't." "Not the engine that's the problem. It's you. You're already looking like them. Can't you tell?" I looked in the mirror. My hands were on the steering wheel. 10 and 2. I couldn't move them, couldn't let go. The rest stop doesn't want your truck, Marcus. It wants drivers, collectors for its collection. You've been here too long, you're already changing. How do I get out? Silence, then. You remember what I taught you about backing up? About using your mirrors? Don't look forward, Marcus. Look back. Drive backward. Don't look at the road ahead, not until you're past mile marker 20. That's insane. So is stopping at mile 23. My hands started to move on their own, turning the wheel, positioning it straight ahead. My eyes wanted to lock forward. It took everything I had to look away, to find the gear shift. I threw it in reverse. The engine roared to life. Driving backward on a mountain road in the dark should have been impossible, but the moment I started reversing, the rest stop began to change. The birds stepped aside, creating a path. The sodium lights flickered and dimmed. The building itself seemed to shift, blur, like it was trying to remember what it was supposed to look like. In my mirrors, I watched the rest stop reveal its true nature. The building stretched and warped, becoming something that hurt to look at directly. The parking lot extended in impossible directions. I caught glimpses of more vehicles, dozens of them, stretching back into the darkness. Cars from decades past. Trucks that looked like they'd been parked there since the 70s. A school bus, a hearse, all with their occupants still inside, all waiting. I kept my eyes on the driver's side mirror, watched the exit ramp approach in reverse. My speedometer showed 15 km/h backward, 20, 25. Something slammed into my passenger door. That tall man from before, but not quite. His face had given up pretending to be human. It was just smooth. A mannequin head with dents where features should be. You need to stay. His voice came through the glass, through the metal, through my bones. Everyone stays. It's so much easier when you stay. Another impact, the woman from the Honda Civic. She pressed against my windshield, hands still positioned like she was driving. Her mouth opened and closed. No sound, just the motion, but I could read her lips. Just resting my eyes. Just resting my eyes. Just resting my eyes. More shapes pressed against the truck, the family from the Tahoe, the motorcyclist still straddling his invisible bike. Others I hadn't seen before. They moved like sleepwalkers, like people caught in a dream they couldn't wake from. And behind them all, standing at the edge of the light, more figures watched. These ones were different, older. They wore clothes from different eras. A woman in a 50s dress, a man in a zoot suit, a child in overalls that might have been from the 30s. The original collection, maybe. The ones who'd been here longest. The ones who'd forgotten they were ever anything but part of this place. I hit the exit ramp doing 30 in reverse. The truck lurched, tilted, almost jackknifed, but I held it steady. Grandpa Joe had made me practice backing up for hours when I first started driving. Most important skill a trucker can have, he'd said. Knowing how to back out of trouble. The interstate appeared in my mirror. Empty, dark, beautiful. I swung the wheel hard, felt the trailer start to slide. Corrected just enough. The truck spun, almost graceful, until I faced the right direction on the entrance ramp. That's when I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. The rest stop was gone. Not abandoned, not distant, gone. Just empty mountain and darkness where it had been. But the Freightliner was behind me, gaining fast. The driver's face filled his windshield, that same frozen stare, hands at 10 and 2 even as his truck accelerated. Mile marker 22 flashed by. The Honda Civic joined him. Then the Tahoe. All driving in perfect formation, all gaining. Their headlights formed a constellation of pursuit, growing brighter in my mirrors. Mile marker 21. My radio exploded with voices, dozens of them, all saying the same thing. Just rest your eyes. Just for a minute, long drive ahead. But underneath the voices I could hear something else. Music. An old country song from the 70s. The kind Grandpa Joe used to play, and his voice, singing along. Keep on truckin', boy. Keep on moving. Don't you look back now. Mile marker 20. The voices stopped. The headlights behind me vanished. I was alone on the interstate, rain suddenly hammering my windshield again, like I'd driven back through that curtain. I didn't stop until Princeton, pulled into the Flying J truck stop. Bright lights and normal people and the beautiful smell of diesel and coffee. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the fuel nozzle. The mechanic there looked at my radiator. The hose wasn't cracked, wasn't leaking, nothing wrong with it at all. "You sure it overheated?" he asked. I didn't answer, couldn't, because I'd just noticed the time. 3:47 a.m., same time I'd pulled off the interstate. Like those 90 minutes hadn't happened at all. I made my delivery in Charlotte, on time. Nobody asked about the dents in my passenger door. The security cameras at the furniture warehouse didn't show them anyway. Only I could see them. Only I knew they were there. That was 3 days ago. But the changes didn't stop when I left that place. They followed me home. My apartment felt different when I got back. Smaller. Wrong. The angles of the walls didn't look right. My furniture seemed positioned strangely, like someone had moved everything 2 inches to the left while I was gone. And cold. Always cold now, no matter how high I turned the heat. The dreams started that first night. Not nightmares exactly. Just sitting. Behind the wheel of my truck, hands at 10 and 2, staring at an endless road that never changed. In the dream, I was peaceful, content. There was no need to move, no need to think. Just the road ahead and the gentle idling of the engine. I'd wake with my hands cramped from gripping the bedsheets in that same position. Last night, my CB radio turned on by itself. Different voice this time. A woman. Young. Scared. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm at mile marker 23 and something's wrong with this place. The other drivers, they won't talk to me. They just sit there. Please, if anyone can hear this." I grabbed the handset. Almost answered. Almost told her to run. But then I remembered what Grandpa Joe used to say. Some folks are meant to stop there, Marcus, and some are meant to drive on by. The trick is knowing which one you are. I turned off the radio, unplugged it, went to bed. This morning, I found a note on my windshield. Don't know how it got there. My truck was locked. Alarm never went off. The handwriting was my grandfather's. "You did good, kid, but you came too close. They know you're sent now. Stay off 77. Find other routes. And whatever you do, never mention mile marker 23 to another driver. Some of them aren't drivers anymore. They're recruiting." I'm sharing this story anyway. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it makes me one of them now. Spreading the word. Making people curious. Making them want to see for themselves. But after what I found today, I can't stay silent anymore. I went to the Huntington Public Library. Spent 6 hours going through old newspapers, accident reports, missing persons files. What I found changed everything. The last Appalachian rest stop has been demolished 14 times since 1952. Each time, they find new reasons. Structural problems, environmental concerns, budget cuts, but it keeps coming back. Different contractors, different materials, always the same design, always between mile markers 22 and 24. The disappearances go back further than I thought. 73 years of people vanishing on that stretch of highway. Not just truckers. Families on vacation, salesmen, college kids heading home for the holidays. The reports all say the same thing. Vehicles found abandoned, engines running, no signs of struggle. But here's the part that made my blood freeze. Some of those missing people have been found. Years later. Decades later, still driving. Still on the roads. Other drivers report seeing them, always on Interstate 77, always between Beckley and Princeton, always driving the speed limit in the right lane, always alone. The descriptions match the missing persons reports perfectly, down to the clothes they were wearing. The only difference, their license plates are always expired, by years. sometimes by decades. And there's something else, something that explains why Grandpa Joe knew to warn me. His name was on one of those reports, Joseph Marcus Webb, reported missing in 1952 while driving a load of coal from Kentucky to Virginia. Vehicle found abandoned at mile marker 23. He was 28 years old. But that's impossible. The Joe Webb I knew lived to be 81. He raised me after my parents died, taught me to drive, left me his truck and his warnings. Unless the man I called grandfather was never really my grandfather at all, unless he was one of them, one of the collected, and somehow he broke free. Somehow he escaped and built a life in the real world, had a family, had a grandson, and spent his whole life making sure I'd never end up like him. The photo from his notebook makes sense now. Those blank faces, that wrong building. He wasn't taking a picture of the rest stop. He was documenting it, keeping track, trying to understand what had happened to him. The notebook itself, those routes, those warnings, those names. It wasn't just advice for a new trucker. It was a map, a guide to all the places like mile marker 23, all the traps waiting along America's highways. Because the last Appalachian rest stop isn't unique. It's just one collection point in a network that stretches across the country. Truck stops that shouldn't exist. Rest areas that appear on no maps. Roadside diners that serve coffee that tastes like nothing and keep their customers forever. I've started mapping them based on Grandpa Joe's notes. 27 locations across 15 states, all with the same pattern. All with the same collection of drivers who just needed to rest their eyes for a minute. Epilogue. The warning. But if you're reading this, if you drive trucks or even just drive those lonely stretches of interstate highway, remember this: the last Appalachian rest stop is still there. Mile marker 23. Waiting between Beckley and Princeton. It's always there, even when it isn't. And every night, the collection grows. Those drivers you pass on the interstate, the ones driving perfect speed in the right lane, never speeding, never slowing, never stopping except at mile marker 23. Look at their hands next time. 10 and 2, always 10 and 2, even when the road curves. I ended up researching mile marker 23 after all this. Couldn't help myself. Found an old newspaper archive from 1978. Headline: Rest Stop to Close After String of Disappearances. 14 people vanished that year. Truckers mostly. Some families. Cars found empty. Engines running. No sign of struggle. The rest stop was demolished in 1979. The thing is, I have the receipt for my fuel stop in Princeton. Time stamped and everything. Paid with my credit card. The charge shows on my statement. But I also have my GPS log from that night. The company tracks all their trucks. According to the log, I never left the interstate. Never took that exit. The data shows me driving straight through from Beckley to Princeton. No stops. So, which is real? The 90 minutes I remember at a rest stop that doesn't exist, or the computer saying I never stopped at all. I don't know anymore. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving other routes now, staying far from Interstate 77, my CB radio turns on by itself, just static mostly. But sometimes, if I listen close, I can hear them, all those drivers, still sitting at mile marker 23, hands at 10 and 2, waiting. Just resting our eyes, they say. Just for a minute. Long drive ahead. The longest drive. The one that never ends. Because here's the thing about that rest stop. The thing my grandfather knew. The thing I know now. It's not really gone. It's just waiting for you to need it. Waiting for that moment when your engine overheats, or your eyes get heavy, or you just need to stop for a minute. Just a minute. And when you take that exit, when you pull into that empty parking lot, check your mirrors before you get out. Count the cars that were already there. And whatever you do, whatever you see, don't look up. The birds are always watching. They're watching right now. So let me ask you, have you ever driven through southern West Virginia at night? Have you ever passed mile marker 23? Did you notice the exit that shouldn't be there? The one your GPS doesn't show? Or maybe you've stopped there. Maybe you're still there, sitting in your car, hands at 10 and 2, reading this on your phone while you rest your eyes. Just for a minute. Long drive ahead.